Imagine this, a city in chaos, a villain hiding behind a mask, and a man who's about to become a hero, whether he wants to or not. But just when you think you've figured out the villain's plan, bam! A twist so wild it'll have you second-guessing everything you thought you knew. This is a story of revenge, crime, and a whole lot of shocking moments. But before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Dropping a like and a comment is the least you can do to show some love. And like we always say, even if some stories seem the same, they ain't never the same when I'm the one telling them. The movie starts with Inspector Cosme, a man carrying a heavy heart. He had 2 sons, and his eldest was a hero. 2 years ago, there was a big fire in Madrid. His eldest son, an agent at the time, rushed into the burning building to save people, even before the firefighters arrived. He sacrificed his life for others, and Cosme lost everything. Cosme still has his younger son, Jorge, but he's nothing like his older brother. Jorge spends most of his time at home, glued to comic books. If he can lie down, he's not getting up. He runs a comic book store and has a strange obsession with things like electric guns. In Cosme's eyes, Jorge is, well, a bit of a disappointment. His oldest son was a hero, while Jorge just wasn't that guy. But after the tragedy, Cosme became more lenient with Jorge. At least he still had him. As long as Jorge is happy, that's all that really matters. Cosme is about to retire, and David, the new guy, has been assigned to take over. David's the kind of guy who looks cool, like he stepped out of an old movie. Think Alain Delon, but with a modern twist. In his free time, David loves boxing, which makes him look even tougher. With Cosme's years of experience, he's been guiding David as they work on tough cases together. One day, they get a call about a creepy apartment building where the neighbors hear someone lifting weights every night. Recently, there's been a strange, awful smell. When they arrive, they find a muscular body, but something about the scene feels off. The victim is in a strange position, and it looks like he was strangled by a weight bar. There's no obvious evidence, just lots of protein powder and muscle-building supplements. But the truth? This wasn't some gym accident. The victim wasn't a bodybuilder. He was a thin physicist who owned a chemical factory. A year ago, he vanished without a trace. It's hard to believe he just decided to go hide away and get jacked at the gym. The forensic report comes in, and the truth is shocking. The victim was murdered. The killer forced him to drink protein shakes, work out non-stop, and take dangerous banned chemicals. The chemicals made his skin go pale and his muscles bulge. From a scrawny chemist, he was turned into a bulky man. But why would the killer go through all that trouble? Just when things seem confusing, a woman dressed like Sailor Moon storms in, scolding Cosme for taking on such a tough case and telling him it's time to retire. This woman is Norma, David's boss. She's young, but don't let that fool you. She graduated top of her class at the police academy. Despite her age, she leads the serious crimes unit. Oh, and her hobby? Cosplay. Honestly, with a boss like that, who wouldn't want to go to work every day? Later that afternoon, another strange murder happens. The victim, a rich weapons manufacturer, has had his heart ripped out and been stuffed into an iron suit, kept alive only by machines. To make it even weirder, there's a strange poster taped to his head. Is someone using superhero stories to copy their crimes? The homicide unit hits a dead end, but there's always someone who spots the key clue right away: Jorge. Even though Cosme is about to retire, he's determined to crack the case. While going through the files at home, Jorge has an aha moment. He notices that the first victim looks like the Hulk. In the 60s, the Hulk wasn't green, he was gray. And guess what? The same thing applies to Iron Man. Looks like Jorge's comic book obsession is finally coming in handy. Could these murders really be connected to comic books? Cosme rushes to the crime scene and starts examining it carefully. Beneath the weight machine, he finds a poster from the very first issue of The Incredible Hulk. There's also a note that says, "Unknown Origins." This gives Cosme a crazy idea. Maybe the second murder was inspired by Iron Man's story. Cosme rushes back to report to Norma, suggesting that his comic book-obsessed son, Jorge, should team up with David on the case. After all, David doesn't know a thing about comics. But David isn't too happy about this idea. He looks at Jorge, still obsessed with comics at his age, and thinks, what a failure. But even David had to admit, Jorge had been a huge help in solving the case. When they go back to the second murder scene, Jorge looks at the weapons like they're priceless treasures. He spots things like the sword of Kan Nam, the katana of a warrior, the ice sword, and more. But then, Jorge notices something off. One weapon doesn't belong. While the others come straight from Lord of the Rings, the axe is totally different. It's from the Bermuda Triangle, and that's a clue left by the killer. The axe has 3 fingerprints on it, but the forensic results will take time. So David decides to head over to Jorge's comic book store to brush up on superhero comics. Coincidentally, Norma is there too, showing off her cosplay designs to some older gentlemen. Looks like the case might be taking a weird turn. David thought Norma wasn't really focused on her job, but the group quickly made fun of him for thinking that. It turned out that the people living in these fantasy worlds weren't the losers David had assumed. They were actually successful dentists, professors, judges, and even billionaires with luxury cars and mansions, all of them passionate about comic books. This completely changed David's view. He realized that comic book lovers could be wealthy and successful, not just dreamers. He went back to the office to study more superhero comics. Not long after, Norma shows up with the fingerprint report from the axe. The prints belonged to an arsonist who had killed 6 people. Looks like this case is getting darker. This criminal was clever, tricking the jury into thinking the fire had been an accident. He was only sentenced to 6 months in jail. Time was running out, so David, Norma, and Jorge rushed to the arsonist's house. But they were too late. The house was filled with thick smoke, and the smell of burning flesh was unbearable. Inside, they heard horrible screams. In the chaos, David and Norma accidentally touched hands, and Jorge noticed. It wasn't the time for flirting, though. There was a criminal to catch. The bad guy was trapped inside a completely sealed suit, like a fish wrapped in foil, roasted alive. Jorge spotted a comic book poster at the scene and quickly recognized it. It was from Johnny Storm of the Fantastic Four. The medical examiner was stunned. He said that the suit wasn't something an ordinary person could make. It controlled the fire, roasting the victim slowly for 3 days. The killer wasn't just cruel, he was a sadistic psychopath. With the case at a standstill, David suggested they ask Cosme for help, but Norma explained that Cosme was battling cancer. Taking on this case would only add more stress, possibly shortening his life. That's why she had pushed him to retire, so he could enjoy his last years in peace. Feeling guilty, David went to visit his old mentor. Over lunch, Cosme asked David why he became a cop. David explained that when he was 8 years old, he and his parents had left a movie theater. They were attacked by a mugger, and his parents were shot dead right in front of him. To this day, the killer who had murdered David's parents had never been caught. David became a cop because he didn't want anyone else to go through what he did. He wanted to make the world a better place, but police rules stopped him from investigating cases involving his own family, so he never knew who the killer was. This was David's biggest regret. Jorge thought this rule was unfair and suggested they ask Norma for help. With such a generous boss, things could be a lot easier. It didn't take long for David to find the file on his parents' case from 20 years ago, but what shocked him was a piece of evidence, a comic book poster from a Batman story. This meant the killer who murdered David's parents could be the same person or part of the same group behind the recent murders. David was stunned. How could this be? What was the killer's motive, and who would be the next target? Norma carefully thought about the situation and said, "This killer is probably very rich, with equipment like heart implants and incineration devices. All of this costs a lot of money. Could wealthy comic book lovers be the ones they needed to look at?" Norma's words gave Jorge an idea. He realized that people who collect original comic book editions are usually very wealthy. So they decided to ask someone who knew this world. This person told them about Victor, the only man in Madrid who owned 4 original comic book editions. Victor also had valuable comics and was a major player in the real estate business. Jorge quickly jumped into action, planning a dramatic comic book-style showdown with David. But David, worried that Jorge would stir up trouble, tricked him into going home and drove alone to Victor's house. When David arrived, he found a dark warehouse with walls covered in comic book posters, including Detective Comics number 33 featuring Batman. In the corner, he spotted a bound corpse. Startled, David fired his gun, but he accidentally triggered a poisonous gas trap attached to the body. Moments later, David was ambushed by a man wearing a plague doctor mask, looking just like Major Grom. The attacker congratulated David for finding the villain's lair, but coldly told him, "You're not worthy of being a hero yet." David had breathed in too much of the hallucinogenic gas and was starting to feel weak. As he struggled to stay conscious, he sarcastically asked the masked man to at least tell him his name so he could die with some dignity. The man smirked and revealed, "I'm Professor Navarro." Just then, Norma burst in, shooting the masked man, but he played dead, tricking Norma. He then laughed wickedly and disappeared into thin air. It turned out that Jorge, worried David might be in danger, had called Norma for help. David was deeply thankful, and this event brought him and Norma even closer. In the warehouse, David found more clues. Along with the 4 comic book series linked to the earlier murders, there were two more, X-Men and Spider-Man. Both were about radioactive mutations. This hinted that the plague doctor's next crime would somehow copy one of these stories. But there were still no clues about who the next victim might be. The coroner also made a shocking discovery. It turned out that Victor had been dead for 4 or 5 years, and his body had been preserved in formalin. The most surprising part was that the plague doctor had been using Victor's identity to carry out the crimes. Even more unsettling, Victor's body had traces of radiation in it. Because of this, the case was passed on to national security. David wasn't ready to give up. After all, the killer who had taken his parents' lives was still out there. The coroner, seeing David's determination, promised to provide a report the next day. David knew the risk, but he was willing to take it to get answers. Grateful, David continued his search, and then Norma offered to help. Without thinking, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, not wanting her to face any danger. Later that afternoon, the news broke about another victim, a young criminal recently released from prison. His body was found hanging from the roof of a bus station. It was clear the murder was copying the Spider-Man story, but once again, there were no clues to follow. Even with all their effort, the name Professor Navarro turned up no answers. With only 1 day left, David was starting to lose hope. He couldn't make sense of it all, but Jorge was connecting the dots between the 5 cases. If the plague doctor had mimicked the Batman story to kill David's parents 20 years ago, then sent David to Madrid's police department, leaving clues along the way, this clearly wasn't just about murder. It was a twisted game to create a villainous superhero and show off his own evil side. David thought Jorge's theory was ridiculous. He wasn't about to let comic book stories mess with real life. Frustrated, David stormed off. David was stuck. Without the usual methods of investigation, he couldn't make any headway. He spent a lot of time thinking, and finally, it hit him. He was the one holding back the team from solving these cases. David realized he needed help, and with humility, he asked Jorge to guide him. That night, Jorge's comic book store was buzzing with excitement for its 10th anniversary. Jorge handed David a superhero suit and grinned. "If the villain wants you to be a hero, you need a good name," he said. He had already come up with one. With Norma by their side, they formed a team called the Tripod, and David's new nickname would be Spawn, the three-sided hero. The name Spawn sounded a bit childish to David, leaving him momentarily speechless. But he quickly shook it off and asked Jorge, "What do we do next?" Jorge explained that villains, when they can't get what they want, often target the hero's loved ones or friends to force the hero into action. And just as Jorge finished speaking, Norma burst into the store, breathless, saying Cosme had been kidnapped. At that exact moment, David's phone rang. It was the plague doctor, who told him Cosme was tied up in a warehouse by the reservoir. The villain warned that if David didn't come to save Cosme, he would poison the city's water supply with radiation, killing everyone. This was David's final chance to step up and become the hero he was meant to be. The villain's voice echoed through the phone, warning David that the soda in the store had already been laced with radiation. Before the villain could even finish speaking, the people who had drunk the soda started to collapse. Poison. Panic spread quickly as Jorge, terrified for his father, tried to rush in and help, but David stopped him. He knew Jorge wasn't ready for this kind of fight and would only get in the way. David insisted on handling the rescue on his own. Grateful but understanding, Jorge helped David get his brother's special agent suit and handed him a weapon. "I'm ready to be your rock," Jorge said, and the suit truly gave off the feeling of a hero. Of course, Spawn needed a ride. The store's chairman had just arrived for the anniversary party, and Norma immediately took charge, borrowing his car to head to the reservoir with David. At the warehouse by the reservoir, the plague doctor finally revealed his twisted plan. Cosme was meant to be Professor Xavier in a wheelchair, and only then would the villain's plan to create a superhero be complete. Slowly, the villain took off his mask, showing his true face and purpose. He explained that his goal was for Cosme to die in peace. The shocking truth came out. The plague doctor was the coroner, a man who had become so obsessed with comic books that he lost touch with reality. He was also a perfect example of an antisocial personality, thinking that society was beyond saving and that only a superhero could fix it. To make his dream come true, he was willing to be the villain in order to create a hero. The villain snapped a steel rod in half as he proudly praised himself, declaring that his masterpiece was about to arrive to save the day. He was ready to fight, and if he lost, he would kneel, beg, and even die just to make his opponent a true hero. Cosme, struggling to understand the madness, couldn't believe this maniac was killing innocent people for such a ridiculous reason. Filled with anger, the coroner claimed that these murders were acts of divine justice. He raged about how the physicist had dumped toxic waste near a school, killing dozens of children, but the law couldn't touch the corporation behind it. He spoke of how the weapons manufacturer was secretly a drug lord, and how the arsonist had lied his way out of a conviction. Even the dismemberment killer had escaped justice. They were all cancers in society, and so many others like them walked free. How could people ever have hope. In frustration, Cosme mocked the villain, asking if he thought he was Jesus Christ. The villain, with a calm expression, replied that he hadn't gone that far yet. Then, to everyone's horror, he injected something into his face, dunked his head into acid, disfiguring himself, and declared that Heath Ledger was the true saint. It turned out he was a die-hard fan of Ledger's Joker. In reality, his goal wasn't to create a hero, it was to create a new Joker, wearing his Plague Doctor mask. Before David could reach him, the Plague Doctor shot and killed Cosme. In his final moments, Cosme, in a daze, thought he saw his beloved eldest son embracing him, but in reality, it was just an illusion. David was the one by his side. As Cosme took his last breath, David rushed forward, determined to fight the villain. After a fierce struggle, David began to weaken and couldn't keep up with the Plague Doctor. He had to draw his weapon to try to turn things around, but in mere seconds, the villain overpowered him again, leaving him as prey on the chopping block. Strangely, the Plague Doctor didn't want to kill him. He pretended to slip, grabbing the edge of a ledge, as if it were all part of some twisted script. The villain began begging for mercy, but David, his vision clouded by hatred, declared, "I'm not a cop anymore. I'm Spawn, a true superhero." In the end, the villain got what he wanted. The Plague Doctor let go and fell into the acid vat below, disappearing into it, just like the Joker's famous fall. From my point of view, he had planned it all, creating Spawn while playing the role of the reborn Joker. With all the effort he put into this, there's no way he's truly dead. He's probably hiding somewhere, secretly plotting his next move. After all, a world without enemies would be too boring. In the end, the trio received an unexpected surprise. The Plague Doctor had left them a mansion and a large fortune. Down in the basement, they discovered a machine capable of hacking into governments worldwide. For all his evil, the Plague Doctor did have quite the vision. And so, Spawn began his journey of fighting evil in Madrid. Maybe one day, a real Joker will emerge to face him. What would you do if you were David, thrown into a deadly game with a psycho villain hiding behind a Plague Doctor mask? Would you fight until the end? Or would you find a way to outsmart him? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. I want to hear your thoughts on how you'd handle this crazy ride.